Go.
Hello.
Well, let me spotlight. Spotlight. There she is.
Hi, Leanna.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, welcome everyone. This is our interview between the King from the Radio, Torres, and Leanna Renee Heiber, an author who actually developed her own genre, which I have a question about. So, Mark, would you take it away, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Judith. Welcome to the online EMcon event. This is their 10th anniversary, which is amazing. I am here with super awesome person, artist, writer, musician, actress, ghost tour guide. What else do you do?
Well, I do all kinds of things in the arts. I'm also an actress. I recently developed my own one-woman show about a 19th century female designer. As you mentioned, I'm a ghost tour guide. I am a jeweler. I do jewelry. I do all kinds of different things, but first and foremost, I am an author and a storyteller by trade and training. So I studied, I got my theater degree, and so I studied doing classical theater, a lot of Shakespeare, a lot of historical work, because I've always been really interested in history. And so history is kind of the main through line through a lot of my work.
Now, this is our third time interviewing you.
Yes, I am so glad to be back.
And it's weird because it's just like your book series. So how do you decide to let people know who you are, and yet people who have been here before, keep them interested? So when you're writing a book, do you decide, okay, at this point in time everybody knows who I am, so let me just get to the meat and bones of it? Or do you have to kind of work your way around to trying to get people to be familiar with who you are, what you're doing, and then continue the story?
That's a great question. One of the things that I try to do is to treat each one of my different book series as a new starting off point. For anyone who is not familiar with my books, there are crossover characters who go from one series to the next, and you see familiar friends. So those who have read me for a long time are excited to see how this family that they've been following now for several different series, what their child is like, what the adventures they all get up to. But I don't act like you have to have read everything I do to join into the new thing. So I think that's what's important for authors, is to think about each one of their different projects as a jumping off point for something new. So I try to reference some backstory. If you need to know a few things in order to understand where the story is now, I'll put that in terms of references, in terms of conversations between characters. But I really want folks to feel like they could pick up any one of my books and dive in. One of the things I try to do too, as a person and as someone who presents very gothic and goth in my whole wardrobe and aesthetic, is that that's a clue to you too. So for a lot of authors, we call this sort of a branding thing, where you are sort of yourself and your brand and you're representing what you do. This is very authentic to me. I've been a goth since I was a teenager, and it's not a phase, it's just who I am. And so that look of sort of this gothic Victoriana, it works really well with my books. And so a favorite tagline of mine when I'm at events and people are like, oh, I love your outfit, I like your whole vibe, I'll say, if you like my clothes, you like my books. I dress like I write. And so there's this invitation in to what I do via how I'm dressed and the interests I so clearly show. So for other artists, I think having something on your person, having something that's like at your table or wherever you are, that's an introductory piece, something visual that can be a way to get conversation going between people, that's part of that branding. And it's also showing who you are and your own passions. So for me, it's very authentic to me, and I wouldn't recommend anyone dressing up in a way that doesn't feel authentic to them or doesn't feel like it's them, because that kind of thing then isn't the best representation of yourself. The great thing about art is expressing yourself and being yourself and being able to share that in an artistic way of any kind. And that goes for any kind of self-expression.
So even if you decide to wear a shirt that says, hi, I'm an author, buy my book, that qualifies in a way, As long as you're comfortable and it fits your brand.
Exactly. If you're the type of person that is just gregarious and just wants to go out there and advertise on your shirt that, hey, look at me, I'm here as a commercial, that's actually totally fine. And it is, it is a way to sort of say, oh, that person is clearly an author. Okay, great. Tell me about your books. It might be good to have something about your books on that t-shirt about their genre, because while I love reading a whole bunch of different genres, I do like to know what genre I'm reading. Sometimes you can get that from the book cover itself. There's usually a lot of clues there, but I really like hearing from the authors why they are writing what they're writing.
Now, you mentioned genre, and as Jude mentioned earlier from the library, East Meadow Public Library, you created your own genre. So how does that work? Where somebody comes up to you, what kind of a book is it? And you're like, well, it's how do you decide how that happens?
Well, that has been an interesting, tricky thing, and while I dearly appreciate the credit for inventing my genre,
Take the credit.
I'm only one of several folks who are writing what the kinds of things I'm writing. Although I will say that my publisher, I'm published with several different publishers. Tor Books is one of them, and Tor has been known for a long time for doing historical fantasy. So the genre that Tor has said I have helped create is called gas lamp fantasy. Now that term refers to the idea of gas lamps in lighting, the era of the 19th century when steam power was powered. So that's how we get this term steampunk, for a sort of a steam powered tech and a Victorian science fiction kind of feel. For me, because my work, rather than technology, I solve problems with magic and mysticism and ghosts and paranormal things that are very familiar to the fantasy genre, more so than, say, the sci-fi genre. That's why my books are termed gas lamp fantasy, because gas lamp gives you the term of the era that it's set in, and also the atmosphere, the idea of when the street lights were gaslit and they had that flame. There's a real atmosphere to the streets of London and the streets of New York where my books are set in the 1800s. So the fantasy lets you know that while it's set in the 1880s, there's going to be fantastical things. There's going to be ghosts and prophecies and mythological things bursting out into the streets. So it's a cross-genre term, and all of my books are, because my books could be considered YA, and some have been shelved there. Other of my books have been shelved in just regular sci-fi fantasy, because I have a broad range of characters, some of whom are teenagers and some of whom are adults. So it depends on the publisher as to where I've been shelved in terms of how they categorize my work.
So just tell them to put you everywhere.
Pretty much. I mean, I'm happy with that. I try to say there's something for everybody.
And that's another follow-up question. So a lot of times I always see that you're billed as a YA author. So is that something that you decide when you're starting out, that I'm going to be a YA author, or do you just write what you write and then the audience finds itself and then they decide, oh, she's a YA author?
That's a great question, and it's a little bit of both, because in some cases I know that there's going to be a focus on so many of the adult characters, in which case it's going to be shelved in adult. It's usually really the focus on the characters. If you have a lot of main characters who are younger, it's probably going to be shelved in YA. If you have a main character who might be young, but most of the rest of the cast is older, then it's probably going to be shelved in adult. Some of that is content related, of course, too. If you have like rated R content, obviously that's not going to be a YA book. I keep everything in a PG-13 kind of context, because I do have a YA series, and I want my young readers, I have some young readers who are reading kind of above their age. So I want a 9-year-old who picks up Darker Still, which was categorized specifically as a YA. If they pick up anything else that I do, I still want it to be in that PG-13 range. Everything I write is under my real name, and it's all under the same name. Other authors, if they're doing a very different content shift, like if they've got a young adult series and then they have something that has more explicit or racy content, then they'll change pen names for that. And that's a clue that it's not going to be the same thing from one to the next. But because all of mine is under my real name, I try to keep in that PG-13 range. When my first publisher closed, I was with a house when I published in 2009. That company went bankrupt a few years into my career, and it was really scary. And I thought I was gonna you know, I thought I was done for. But I was able to follow one of the editors who knew my work at the previous house. She went and got a job at a different publisher, and she was exclusively buying young adult YA. And she said, I know that you have a YA voice. I know that you have work that is cross-genre enough to write a YA. Can you do a story focused just on teenagers, still do your historical thing, and then we'll publish it as a YA? And so I was basically following her lead and following a publisher connection to be able to continue my career after I'd had a run of bad luck. So part of this business is going where opportunities are and trying to be adaptable and yes, sticking with your voice, but also the focus, where your voice focuses on, the scope of it, be able to be flexible about that, especially with editors that you like to work with, and you might want to follow them to the new publishing house that they work with.
Oh, I know we have an open chat on the Facebook Live, and we have a chat here on the Zoom. So if anybody has a question, make sure you
Yes,
put it
please.
down there, and I will read it. But let's just go right into it and tell us a little bit about this newest book, and how does it continue the story in your trilogy? Is it a trilogy or is it an ongoing story? Let's start with that.
The Spectral City
Series.
it's inherently a trilogy right now. So the Spectral City series, it's going to be a 3-part arc. If I do continue the series, it will be in a different manner, focusing on different characters. That is very up in the air right now. I will not be continuing the series in the same way that I've been. So we have a good extant trilogy, the third of which is coming out in July. And then if it goes forward from that, it kind of depends on the timetable of my other projects. So there's a little bit of stuff up in the air. I have some ideas of how to continue it, but I do know that these 3 books are books I'm very proud of, and my editor is very proud of them too. She says the next one that's upcoming is her favorite book of the 3, which is kind of hard to kind of maintain steam sometimes. And I'm really glad that she likes the third one as much as any of the others, but I'll do a little show and tell here. That's the beautiful cover. It's called A Sanctuary of Spirits. Now, this is the 2nd book of the trilogy. The 3rd book is called A Summoning of Souls, and it's coming out in July. You can pre-order it wherever books are sold. So wherever you like to get books, you can type in A Summoning of Souls and it'll come up. Right now, the pre-order links are just for the ebook, the digital book. We will have print copies just like this in trade paperback, and those links will be up in a little while. I'll also be doing in July, if you follow me on any of my social media, come July, I'll be doing a big pre-order campaign for the 3rd book. And that book is going to help support Word bookstores in Brooklyn. One of the things in this current climate that's really tricky, publishers and authors, all of us are being hit real hard with all kinds of different difficulties with the current crisis. So I'm trying to partner with a local bookstore so that you can get signed copies of the latest book, and that'll support Word in Brooklyn. So it's a brick and mortar independent store. They do a lot for the community. So trying to kind of figure out ways we can have author and bookstore and reader solidarity right now. But this is my latest, and I love this baby. Basically, it picks up where the first book leaves off, and all you need to know coming into the series, you could actually pick up this book and not have read the first one. I have many reviewers and many readers who have said that. You'll miss a little bit of the backstory, but basically all you need to know about the Spectral City series is psychic detectives. There are psychics, they are detectives, and they use the help of their favorite friendly ghosts to help solve weird crime in New York City in 1899. And I chose that time period because, hey, a lot of us here are New Yorkers. I know folks might be joining us from other places, but New York, you guys, in the 19th century, New York was so incredible. So many things were happening. People were coming from all around the world, and they were bringing their innovation, their intelligence, their unique perspective on life. They were coming in and they were making new things, and technology was advancing so rapidly. It's hard to think that in the 1890s that telephones were operative, but they were. And in the 1890s, all the telephone operators, they were all women. So there were women working in the field in their fine regalia. There was a lot of different ways in were interacting. There was a lot of class mobility and a lot of opportunity for people of all kinds of different backgrounds that hadn't had opportunity before. So one of the reasons why I love writing in the late 1800s is it was a dynamic time of change. But it's fascinating because alongside the telephone, you also have people who are getting into their horse and carriage. So yeah, they have plumbing and maybe they have electricity, but then across the street, they still have gaslight. And then they get into their carriage to go to, you know, any of the various theaters maybe that are on, you know, such a popular thing in the 19th century. So there's this interesting mix of modern and antiquated that you find in that late 19th century era. So that's why I continue to write there, and also why I love dealing with new technologies and esoterica. You'll notice with this cover, it's very mystical. It's got this third eye in this sort of Illuminati kind of feel to it. And that's very much what this book is about. I'm dealing with a lot of esoterica. And by that, I mean interest in mystical things and spirituality that is different and explorative. So in the 19th century, folks were obsessed with seances and contacting the dead. So that was a real truth. I just make that very real for my characters. They contact the dead through seances and the dead show up. Ghosts go through the wall and they come and they help. So in my book, for the most part, ghosts are friendly ghosts. I'm a Casper kind of lady. I like my friendly ghosts. And the ghosts kind of serve as sort of guardian angels. I think that ghosts can be a new way we can kind of think about the idea of a guardian angel. If you have a spirit of a loved one that's passed, maybe they want to stay on and help you. Maybe they want to stay on and watch over you. And I think that's really exciting. And I think there's a lot of possibilities there. And it also changes how we think about ghost stories. Because, I mean, I am a ghost tour guide, and part of my business is to spook you all with spooky things about ghosts, sure. But I also think there's two sides of that. And my character, my heroine, Eve Whitby, she likes to say, I'd like you to think of ghosts as a help, not a horror. So she's trying to sort of solve the problem of ghosts getting a bad rap in society.
So what's interesting is that this is you. It's not like you're making this up from somewhere else. Your personality is shown very much in your books. Now, one thing they always say is to write what you know. So how much research did you have to do? Or was this all stuff that you already had in you and you just decided to put it out?
Well, it's a little bit of both. One of the things that I feel so drawn to this era, I don't know if you're familiar with the concept of past lives. Most people have a sense of the idea of past lives, the idea that there's something in information, another timeline, a long time ago. That's definitely the case for me. I absolutely feel like I had a past life in the 19th century because I just feel like I know things and understand things. I'll look at a building in New York or other places that I've traveled across the country and over in Europe too, where I feel like I'd been there before. And it's an uncanny experience. And anyone who has a particular draw to a kind of time period will know what I'm talking about, because there's something that this ineffable, inexplicable draw that you have to this time period or this place or this way of dress or this language, picking up words that you don't know how you should know them, or finding your way in ways that you didn't know. I kind of knew my way around London before I'd ever been there, Paris too. It was this interesting thing. And I'd had this connection to those time periods since I was a kid, like 7, 8 years old. I would pass historic buildings. Even in rural Ohio, we still had some historic buildings down around Cincinnati. And I would go by these beautiful old churches, and especially with Gothic architecture. I mean, again, I've been a goth for a long time, passing these Gothic architecture, and I would just be entranced by this historic buildings. So this draw has been with me forever. So I knew that in order to really take this seriously, even when I was a kid, I knew I wanted to study history because I knew I wanted to write about it. I started writing my first novel when I was 11 years old, and it was set in 1888. So this has been like a lifelong thing of writing in the late 19th century. It's been a lifelong obsession. But like with many things that you have an obsession about, a lot of times if you want to take that professionally, you're also going to need some training that's going to correlate with that, that's going to sort of back that up in professional spaces. So when I went to school for theater, I got a minor in the Victorian era. I took a bunch of classes about Victorian literature and art, especially because I love the idea of what artists were trying to say, visual artists were trying to say in the 19th century. I love 19th century artists and the way in which they were conveying different commentary about society that way. And also innovating in the art sphere, much like technology was innovating in the technological spheres. So innovation, again, a definite through line for me. So I did a lot of research. When I became a tour guide in New York, the reason why I took the test and studied to become a tour guide is because I knew I wanted to work with books set in New York. So all of the research that I was doing to learn about New York history, that would go right into one of my books. Because being an author and an artist it's a rough industry. It is a tough business, I'm not going to lie. You have to kind of have several things that you're good at, that you can adapt your employment depending on the situation and the contract. So for me, being able to be a tour guide, and that research was doing double duty in terms of time for my books, that was a way I could be kind of moving in the same direction as an amateur historian. And I backed that up obviously with some collegiate classes, but I didn't get a degree in history. I got a degree in theater because I wanted to be a performer and I wanted to be a storyteller. And that very much influences my novels too, which are very character based, almost more than anything else. They're very character driven at the core. So it's a mix, I think, for a lot of writers who find a time period or a genre or something that just keeps them going. It's a mix of something in them that they know and that they feel connected to, and then all the research that we have to do to decide. Every single book that I do, I have different spot check research pieces I have to do. Like, I know the general history of 19th century New York, but the specificity of it, that's what year was the Metropolitan Telephone and Telegraph Company extant? Okay, 1892, great. Then that is already in play by 1899 when my book is set. Finding what was there and what wasn't there. And I have some historic guidebooks that are very helpful for me in figuring that out as a tour guide. It's great to have historic tour guide books, because then you've got your dates and your years in play. The other nice thing about writing in the late 19th century is that photography had been around for a long time. So thankfully, there's actually a lot of pictures that I can reference, which is very helpful. So I would say to anyone who's interested in any kind of field, definitely like search your heart for what you are most interested in yourself to keep you going, and then find the research that backs that up.
You know, it's interesting. You have I don't know if you realize this, but you have a theme of what you're saying. It's part research, part being true to yourself.
Yes.
And the third part is just kind of going with the flow, being flexible at the same time, staying to what you're interested in. I mean, did you realize that, or is it just something that just kind of happens?
Well, I appreciate you saying that. And I think in a lot of ways, we know those themes kind of in our hearts, but we don't necessarily think about them. I think it's kind of like an author's voice. When you read an author and you're like, oh, I just feel that way that they write. Voice is a really hard thing. It's not really something you can kind of just sort of work on in the same way that you just have to write a bunch of things and sort of see what the voice ends up turning out to be. Because if you think about it too much, you're almost shooting yourself in the foot, because if you think about it too much, you'll sort of think your way into against a wall, and then you won't be as true to yourself. I think second guessing for artists is kind of a tricky thing. So I think sometimes you just got to go with it. So the idea of adaptability and flow, for sure. So theme, I think, comes out the more that you do your work. And so I don't think you can worry about theme when you're first starting out, because at that point you just have to get out the books that are in your heart, or the art that's in your heart, or the music that's in your heart, or anything, any field. What I'm saying as a storyteller applies to any single field, any discipline, any love, any passion. It all applies. So I think for me, thematically, it's just these things have continued to build. And also, life has shown me that I have to be adaptable while still being true to myself, and trying to find the ways in which these other things that seem like they could be different directions actually are in the same direction. It used to be that like for every job you could find like a nice factory job and you could just stay with that job and you had a pension at the end. I think a lot of industries, for all of us, all of that is broken apart. And so there's really not a way in which we can kind of settle in to a lifelong job in the way that a lot of our ancestors did. So I think for that, sort of needs must. We have to sort of be adaptable. And I think as an artist or any creative personality, adaptation is actually one of the best things. And I think we're actually, as artists, very well suited then to the unpredictability of all industries going forward.
So I see in the chat we have a raised hand, so that means that someone has a question.
Yes, please.
So what is your question, Mr. G?
All right, excellent. Yes, DC. I know you're into a lot of gothic and gothic times, stuff like that, steampunk stuff like that as well. DC has a movie and a comic book with Batman called Gotham by Gaslight.
It's my favorite.
All right, so this question should come easy with you. What if Marvel or DC choose any character, one of you do the same type of theme as they're doing with that? Who would it be, and could you give us like a small little plot in the mix of it?
Oh my God, that's such a good question. Okay, I'm gonna go with my gut instinct, which is Doctor Strange. And if Doctor Strange was doing a gaslit type of world, then he could be traveling between different 19th century venues and trying to solve a mystery. So what I would do is I would have Doctor Strange be a sort of Sherlock Holmes character. And that's really where, which I know is stealing a little bit from Gotham by Gaslight because they were kind of going that same direction too. But if you add the magic that Doctor Strange has to it, you could kind of allude to the fact that it's Sherlockian without it being necessarily right on top of that. You could also be, kind of bringing in League of Extraordinary Gentlemen vibes to it without getting too much on Mr. Moore's coattails there. But I definitely feel like that whole look and idea would be really fascinating with Doctor Strange. Another Marvel character I'd like to kind of jump into that and maybe see what that world would look like in her head would be Scarlet Witch, because she's got such a wild and broken mind in so many ways. I mean, I love that Elizabeth Olsen, when she was preparing for the role, did such deep dive into all the comics and was like, she's messed up. This poor girl is messed up. And I really would love to sort of see her explore in this other kind of gaslit world. What are the terrors? You could make it really spooky, especially since the next Doctor Strange is going to be the multiverse of madness.
Oh, yes, right.
And there's been some talk about, okay, is Scarlet Witch going to have her thought about that? I'm very curious about those things. And so I think that you could really go different from the kind of detective noir thing that Gotham by Gaslight did. You could go a lot more horror with the idea, almost like the original Universal Monsters kind of horror, which is also a property that's been a comic book property for a long time too, thinking about Dracula and Frankenstein and everybody, involving them in a sort of gaslit world. Sort of a Penny Dreadful kind of comic series.
Oh, that'd be
that would be
cool.
where I'd go with it. So obviously I have a few thoughts. Marvel, I'm here if you want to, let me know. And anyone here is part of the chat. You're all on board, okay? Everyone here in the chat, you're part of the creative team. So, keep thinking.
Yeah, that'd be kind of cool to see Doctor Strange and do a combo with Scarlet Witch. That'd be kind of cool. Yeah.
See, I've always wanted to see that team up in, I think honestly, I don't think you could beat them. I think it'd be a pretty unbeatable duo.
So if anybody else has a question, you can put it in the Zoom chat. I know we're also monitoring the Facebook Live chat. So if you have a question there, you can put it on there and we will read it as soon as it comes in our way.
I drink from my spooky mug.
So you mentioned that your characters are getting spirit guides to solve crimes. So when you're writing, do you have to write out the crime first and then figure out how it gets solved, and you have to write from the end to the beginning? How does that process work?
Well, here's where we come into what's tricky for me, and that's plotting. So you should plot your book, and you should plot it as best you can. I get a little lost in the weeds because so much of my books and my theories are absolutely esoteric. So it's like I'm dealing with a lot of this idea of an amorphous spiritual plane that they're going to. So sometimes I just have to kind of write through that to see what that actually means. But in the case of Spectral City, I really wanted it to be a tighter narrative. I wanted it to be 3 mysteries, and in each book, one of those 3 mysteries gets solved. So now for mystery readers who are like hardcore mystery fans, the fact that not all 3 of my mysteries were solved in the first book were really frustrating. And so I got some reviews that were like, okay, I liked this, but it wasn't all solved by the end. Now my fantasy readers who understand trilogies were not ruffled by this at all. So this was an interesting thing where I realized, oh, here's where being cross-genre is kind of tricky in terms of reader expectations, because readers who are just mystery people were like, why isn't it all solved? And I'm like, because I don't have time, and Kensington doesn't want to publish a 600-page book. So I tried to make sure that I at least resolved one thing per book, because it is maddening to not have things resolved at all. So 1 mystery per book. So I knew I had 3 tiers, and I had to challenge myself to not put in more than 3 tiers. So 1 mystery solved per book. And I kind of knew which one was going to get solved per book. That helped me stay on track. And I think because of that, this series is a little more tightly plotted than some of my other books, frankly, to tell you the truth. I'm not gonna lie, there are some flaws in some of my earlier books because I wasn't plotting them as tightly as I tried to do with this series. I think every time, anytime you publish a book, it's never perfect. It's kind of the best you can do, because every writer will tell you that they would continue to edit it to death if they could. So I definitely have tried to sort of say, okay, I have to plot enough so that I don't get myself completely off course. So it's a mixture of plotting so that I know where I'm going, and then also allowing the characters to kind of say where they want to go in the midst of that. So when I'm drafting, I really listen to my characters about what types of things they want to do. I basically kind of try to get in touch with my characters in my mind and sort of say, okay, what are your favorite scenes in this? What are you excited to do? What do you know is going to happen? And if they know what's going to happen, then I just kind of let them show me, and I kind of write down the movie in my mind.
So we have another question from the chat. It says
Great.
from Justin Kenny. It says, biggest literary influences. Are there any authors or series that jump-started your love and interest for writing?
Absolutely. That's such a great question, and I thank you so much. When I was a kid, there was a book of 13 ghost stories, and I couldn't tell you the author because I think it was like somebody was writing under a pen name. It was sort of like a series of just mass market paperback sort of pulpy fiction. That book of 13 ghost stories was like my Bible. And then I had a very clever teacher who knew I was definitely on sort of the dark and spooky side. So when I was about 8 years old, she handed me a complete works of Edgar Allan Poe. And she was sort of like, all right, you're weird, you'll like this. And so and she was correct. And that really set my course. I consider Edgar Allan Poe to sort of be my literary North Star. He's the reason why I was able to reconcile my own interests in a dark side with a way that was productive, much like Poe dealt with his melancholia. That's what they called depression in those days. He dealt with melancholia a lot by writing. He wanted to be a writer. He was a poor man, and he was one of the first working class writers that we have in history. Most other writers in the 19th century, they were wealthy, aristocratic, or landed folks that had means and the ability to sort of leisurely write. Edgar Allan Poe was out there hoofing it. So yes, maybe that was. I'm just looking at Pat's comment of the 13 ghost stories. I promise I will go and I will find, I don't know where it is on my shelf, but I will find the author. But it's like the cover is so, it's so emblazoned on my mind as a staircase and just this wispy ghost in the center of the staircase on this paperback novel it would have been from the 80s. So yeah, so that was one of my favorite things. But yeah, so Poe is such a great influence because I identified with him as a working class guy just trying to make a living as a writer and wanting just the world to to appreciate his work. And and the fact that we lost him so young, it's just such a tragedy. And that really kind of drove me as a kid. And then I just started devouring other 19th century books. So my first earliest great love was Poe, Dracula, Frankenstein, Jane Eyre, all of the Bronte sisters, Wuthering Heights. They were all writing Gothic novels. Of course, Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, Jekyll and Hyde, just so much of the stuff of that era. And these are things that we're continuing to adapt. Modern cinema continues to adapt these tales. So there's something that's, so classic. And then I really also got into a lot of romantic poetry too. So, the romantic poets of the 19th century also were a huge influence for me. And of course, from a fantasy perspective, I mean, Tolkien was a huge influence on me. And then other, the other fantasy themes, even though I don't ever write dragons, I love the Dragon Riders of Pern. So Anne McCaffrey is a huge influence. Ursula K. Le Guin, Octavia Butler, one of the great science fiction fantasy writers of all time. So a lot of folks who were sort of already in kind of a classic literary canon. Shirley Jackson, her story, The Haunting of Hill House, was hugely formative for me. Also, We Have Always Lived in the Castle, another great Gothic. So I noticed a few names that were there for my Gothic literature rant. And so definitely the canon of traditional Gothic literature was huge for me. But also modern mystery writers who are writing in the 19th century. Anne Perry is one. Perry is her last name. Anne Perry does an incredible series of detectives, men and women detectives in the 19th century, and she's meticulously researched. It's just incredible. A modern author who's actually a friend of mine who I love is Deanna Raybourn. Her Victorian mysteries with a butterfly catcher and a butterfly researcher as her main heroine. She's amazing. Sherry Priest, who's a great steampunk author and horror writer. She's incredible. So there's a lot of folks, both traditionally and modern, that factor in. I'm blessed that I have a lot of really talented authors as friends, so I try to read their books. I'm right now reading Zoraida Cordova's beautiful book called Incendiary, and it's sort of a fantastical take on the Spanish Inquisition, but in an alternate world, and it's so amazing, and there's twists and there's turns, and it's like an expert exploration of character study and plot. It's really, really great. It just came out like a week ago. So that's one. If you're looking on your to be read pile, check out Incendiary, because it's an incredible book. So I try to make sure that when I talk about my influences, I'm also lifting up modern authors too. Thank you.
So what's weird is, once again, you hit the point about when you were a child, teachers were a huge influence, and reading was a huge influence, and those things actually set you on your way. So if you were a type of person like, no, I don't like teachers, I don't want to listen to I don't want to read, it would have been a completely different thing. But you were able to still be yourself and find your way to go with the flow in that. I think that's really, it's so cool how you do that.
Well, and they knew, like, teachers could tell that, like, I was a kid who wasn't exactly sure. I was really shy. I was very nervous around people. I had some social anxiety, I'm not going to lie. And I had some issues with fitting in. And so I think that, folks thought that I might really bond with the loner soul of Edgar Allan Poe. And absolutely. And so, I think that's why the whole goth thing appealed to me so much, because it's sort of like an outsider who has a dark side, and we're just trying to kind of find our way. So that was a way for me to kind of have a way to deal with my love of dark and spooky things, but deal with it in a healthy manner. Have a way, an outlet for that stuff, so that it wasn't something that got negative or violent or toxic or anything. I just had a healthy way to explore that stuff.
Okay, so on the chat, they said Chrissy Hirsch found the book 13 Ghosts, Strange But True Stories by Will Osborne.
There's probably more than one 13 Ghosts, because of the strange number of 13. There's probably more than one. So I bet I probably had all versions of them. So 13 tends to be a favorite anthology of ghost stories edition. So any of them, yes, thumbs up. I'm sure they were all formative for me.
So you were mentioning before about how you edit. You're your own worst critic. So when you read other people's stuff, now that you are a professional writer, do you are more critical or less critical when you're reading that stuff? Are you able to separate yourself from your professional writer person to just a person who enjoys that material?
That's such a good question. When it's my friends, I try to just turn everything off that could possibly have any opinion, because I just want to be there for my friends and support what they're doing. And I also want to make sure that I'm reading with something that I can say and recommend. I mean, a lot of being an author is being out on Twitter, that's where I am most often. I'm on Twitter at Leanna Renee. So find me there. And with that, like, I always want to have something nice to say. So I really don't look at my current contemporary friends with any kind of critical eye. There are some things, if there are people I don't know as well, I will kind of have a thought and I'll have an opinion about stuff. An example of this is, I love The Alienist, the book by Caleb Carr. Carr is his last name. The Alienist is one of my favorite novels of all time, and it's a huge influence on the Spectral City series. And that first book is like a perfect book. The sequel, Angel of Darkness, is also a very good book, but it was a case where there were a few editorial sidelines where they went on these side quests, and the side quests did not, for me, drive the plot or the action forward. And I felt like, while I love Carr's writing, I felt like it would be stronger if those were supplemental chapters that they put up like as an addendum or an appendix, or even just as a freebie or a separate novella even. So I do have sometimes opinions, especially when it's taking away from the character through line. For me, I felt like it was sidetracking in a way, and I wanted to get back to the main the murders at hand and the disappearances at hand. So I definitely do have opinions about all that stuff. Would I say that to Caleb Carr in person? Probably not, unless he sort of asks, well, what did you think about Angel of Darkness? And then I would say it kindly. And I'm sure he's probably heard that too. So I think as long as everyone is kind, because everyone is trying their best, that's the most important thing. And so I try to always be positive, constructive, and kind, because there's a lot of vitriol out there and everybody has an opinion, and I don't necessarily need to be another voice saying, oh, you could have done this way.
So speaking of editors and editorial control and side quests, how is it as an author working with someone who's editing your own book for the publisher side? And where do you draw the line saying, no, I am adamant about this part of the story, or no, you know what, I'm going to go with the flow and listen to your edits?
For the most part, I have had fantastic experiences with my editors, and they really understand what I'm doing. And so anything that they are asking, especially in terms of just clarification, I will always happily clarify the things that they may be confused by. Because sometimes I elaborate world building, and sometimes I think I've explained something and it's not as well explained as I think it is. So I definitely want to make sure that someone reading for the first time who isn't familiar with my work is not getting bogged down, or that something I think is clear, either historically in terms of a historic aspect or background. And sometimes it's hard to know how much detail to go into, because historical writers, we can go into too much detail. And then you have all of these historical facts, which are fine if you're on a tour as a tour guide, but not necessarily great if you're trying to solve the mystery and you have a timeline. So editorially, for the most part, I've had a great experience. I look at my editors. One of the reasons why theater was so important for me is because it gave me a great understanding of how to deal with an editorial relationship, because it's like a director. When you're an actor and a director says, hey, can you try this way? What if you took this different angle with this line or this scene or this mood? Can you bring out this aspect of this scene? I transferred that directly into my editorial relationships. So I look at my editors as directors, and they have an outside eye that helps me with my vision. There's only one case where I really sort of set my foot down, and it was with my last Strangely Beautiful book. There's a quartet of books, And the last book in that quartet had 10 years before it actually came out, because that was the one with that publisher that had gone bankrupt. When Tor took over my contracts and got the rights back for that series, I'd had a vision of what that fourth book was going to be for a very, very long time. And so when my editor says, all right, I'm not feeling these muses, the muse characters in this, I'm not feeling them as much as maybe I should. I tried to adapt with that, but I stood my ground on that one, and I said, I can't take out the muses as driving forces. It's tough because they're amorphous creatures. They're not characters in the same way that my living mortal characters were. They were eternal energies, basically. So that was tricky because I had to sort of stay true to my vision. And you know, how that affects the book in the long run, I don't really know. That was a book that, you know, was a book of my heart. But it's tricky to promote a book 10 years after it was supposed to come out. So that's been tricky. Most people who have stuck with it and gone back to that and read it, you know, feel that it's a really great, you know, end to the saga. But it was hard to maintain the momentum and keep the readership going for that long of a time. But I feel that I did what I had to do in that case to make sure that the book retained the vision that I'd had for it, especially considering how many hard knocks that series had faced.
So speaking of finales, since this is your third Spectral City book in the trilogy, how do you decide, all right, this is the ending to satisfy the most amount of people, this is the ending to satisfy yourself, or this is the ending that satisfies the characters in the story?
That's such a good question. And I think that you just have to sort of hope for the best, and it has to kind of fit, it has to sit in your soul. Like, okay, this feels resolved. I have all three of the main mysteries were solved. My characters are on a much better footing. The two characters who were will they, won't they, about trying to get together, have finally confessed their emotions for each other. And so that feels like that's a breakthrough. So I feel like there's sort of it's a happy ending across the board. It's been hard fought. It's a hard fought happy ending, but I think that it really, for me, all of my books lean towards a happy ending and hope, because while I love elements of horror and scary things, I really, as a writer, I want to end on a hopeful note, especially now in our current climate where everything is kind of scary, and everyone is grieving, and there's a lot of difficult stuff in the world. I definitely want to end on hope. So I try to find a hopeful note. And then for me, I think if I do want to continue the series, it's going to be from a different point of view, because I feel like my characters have pretty much said most of what they want to say about what they're doing in life. I like the concept that my characters would just go continuing on solving other mysteries, and whether I write about them or not, they will still be continuing on these other mysteries. So if I change focus and if I change characters, that's going to be something I really have to figure out and determine. All right, how much am I going to write from these other characters' perspectives? Am I going to do a 3-tiered arc for them, or am I just going to do a one-off as like a separate Spectral City one-off here or there? That's a determination I have to make between myself and other publishers that I might be working with for this.
All right, so we have another question in the chat.
Yes.
It is from Judith. It says, whenever you write within your genre, do current situations influence your direction?
Yes and no, because considering that I'm writing historical fiction, everything that I'm dealing with is going to be from that historical perspective. However, I absolutely have dealt with current issues of equality and justice and inclusion for everybody in my work. My work is, it's diverse. It has people from all kinds of different backgrounds and identities and ability levels and talents. And all of my characters, no matter how they identify, they get together, come together to save the day. And I think that's really the most important thing. So for me, I think one of the things that's tricky about our current climate is there's not a whole lot of teamwork that's happening. I think that teamwork for me is really, it's my favorite thing when I get the Scooby Gang together and the Scooby Gang solves a crime. So I'm a very Scooby Gang driven writer. I want to get people who are excited to make a difference. I want to get them together and they can each bring their own unique thing, because I think everyone is so unique. And everyone has their own voice and everyone has their own story to tell and everyone has value and is valid. And so I kind of try to live with that in my work. And so, yeah, that has a historic precedence because there were a lot of injustices historically represented on that were inflicted on all kinds of different people. So I try to create, spaces and places where people can have their own freedom to be themselves. And I think that goes historically and in our current world too. A lot of times for me, I'm still thinking about that girl that I was who was a little lost and who just kind of wanted some friends. And I wrote some of my friends at that time. I had moments of being a lonely kid. And so I wrote I wrote characters to give myself some company. And thankfully I was able to work through that and adjust some of things. And I have since then gained wonderful friends who've been with me for the, for my entire career since then. But I was trying to initially find my way. And so I think there's a part of me that's always still doing that. And I think that that is a timeless thing, that I think everyone will always want to find community.
We have another question on the chat. It is from Pat. It says, do you consider having any vehicles from that time period used in your books? And if so, what types?
So vehicles from the time period. So there were, by the time you get to the late 1890s, there were a couple of Model Ts, a couple of Fords that were in business out there around, but they were not common, especially not out in the mean streets of New York at that time. So I definitely deal with every different kind of carriage that you could have, whether they are open carriages or they're closed carriages or, a hack, a handsome, any kind of word that you can use for carriage. And each one kind of denotes a different thing. But I also talk about the fact that there was an elevated rail in New York City along Lexington and between Lexington and 3rd, there was an elevated rail that was still extant in the 20th century. It only kind of in terms of the long arc of history, it only recently got torn down, really. The L was a huge elevated train line before the subway was put in place. The subway went in 1904. The subway is later than my book set in New York so far. If I may have some early 20th century books. My Strange and Beautiful series does deal with some cars and some other military vehicles because Miss Violet and the Great War deals with World War I. So I definitely deal with all of the various equipment at that point. But I'm really trying to kind of toe that fine line between that ancient feel and that modern feel where we've got some things, but the vehicles haven't quite caught up. But I love talking about streetcars in New York, the trolley cars. There was a really deadly curve down by Union Square. There was a curve, when Park Avenue becomes 4th Avenue, and you've got that atomic clock that's just turning all of its numbers there just on the south end of Union Square Park. That corner was the deadliest corner in all of New York because trolley cars on tracks would come whipping around that corner and people would either get hit or would actually commit suicide on that curve. So just thinking about these ideas of when there were different dangers in New York at that point than there are now. So I definitely love talking about the sounds of that. For me is a real way to put you in a historic period of the sounds of traffic, because there was always traffic in New York City. That's always been a thing since, the dawn of humanity. There's always, traffic of some kind. Less so, of course, when it was a Native American land, less traffic jams at that point. So it's important to remember that Mannahatta was Lenape land. The historical sound of different types of vehicles, I think that's really, really important. So while I'm not necessarily a car enthusiast, I will definitely have to deal with some Model Ts as I inch forward into the early 1900s, and that'll be fun to kind of explore.
All right, so we have 6 minutes left before the
Okay.
panel is over. Let's hit the social media stuff now, and then I'll get to my final question. So social media stuff, where can people reach out to you, hire you, buy the books, all this stuff? Let's hear it.
Honestly, if you just type in Leanna Renee, my first and my middle name, my last name, Heiber, it's like Justin Bieber, but with an H. So if you type that in, everything will come up. My website, which is leannareneheiber.com. My Twitter is my first and my middle name. My Instagram is all 3 names. I'm on Facebook with an author page, but I do not check it very often. I'm not as much of a Facebook person. I'm much more of a Twitter, Instagram person. On my website, you'll find writer's resources. I have a blog that covers everything that was helpful to me when I was first starting out. And also my books are available wherever books are sold. So whether you want them digitally, some of them are in audiobook, not all of them, a few of them are. You can find them at places like Scribed, which is a subscription service. I have some new stuff there where I narrated some of my own books. That's exciting. So yeah, if you just Google my name and you can see what comes up, both at my website, I have everything there that I've published, and support your local independent bookstore. Even if they don't have it on the shelf, they can order it in. So if you're curious about where to start, look on my website as to where book 1 is of the different series. I would definitely start with book 1 of any of my given series and go from there. So Spectral City is my current love. So you can certainly Google the Spectral City and that will come up everywhere. What other
And
questions?
don't forget your public library. So
hi, public library. Sorry, friends. Of course, the public library. So sorry, Judith.
so
I love libraries. So please do. I mean, that's the thing. Libraries have been great, and they've been such a huge part of my career. And libraries buy books from authors. So you are supporting your authors when you get them from the library. So East Meadow has a lot of my books.
All right. So final question. You have ghosts and spirits in your books. Have you ever thought about having those same ghosts or ghosts of your characters in your books in a book set in today's times?
I have thought about that, but my authorial voice, my writer's voice, doesn't do contemporary very well. I can do futuristic, a completely different worlds and sort of a Star Trek kind of vibe. That my Dark Nest books are futuristic. I have a hard time writing contemporary voice. I am currently shopping around a nonfiction book where I do talk about some of my own personal ghost stories, but I'm not sure I have a narrative fiction voice that's contemporary. I have a nonfiction voice that's, you know, sort of the voice I'm using when I talk with all of you. So that is yet to be seen. And I also want to say, if there's any question that I haven't gotten to, I want to respect everybody and also their amazing backgrounds. I see the Millennium Falcon over there, and that's amazing. So thank you for that, because it just makes my day. So I see costuming happening, and I love it. So thanks, friends. This is just badass. So if you have questions that I didn't get to or that I didn't see, you can ask them on any of my social medias. If you go to my website, I also have a contact form there. You can join my mailing list, and also you're welcome to ask a question that goes right to my email. So if there's anything I didn't cover, I'm happy to answer that at another point. I'm an open book.
All right. So thank you very much, Leanna Renee Heiber. Thank you for the EMcon Anime Online Fest. Make sure you go and check out any other panels that you guys have. Let's see if I can do this right. Hold on. Wait, it's not working. Wait, there it is.
I love it. That was great.
Sound
effects and everything. I feel so taken care of.
Closer
to the
microphone.
Yeah, maybe a little closer to the microphone. There you go.
There you go.
All right, thank you so much. Make sure you guys continue to support the East Meadow Public Library and the EMcon Anime Online Fest, and we will see you next time.
Thanks, friends. Yay. You all were great. I appreciate every single one of you. Thank you.